All right, so I can't see the chat while I present, but I will dedicate about 10 minutes at the very end of the session to going over any of your questions. If you have questions or comments as well, please feel free to throw those in the chat. My name is Danielle, and this is going to be a presentation on public transportation and the politics of indiscipline in Dakar, Senegal. This research was conducted in 2017 to 2018 as part of my master's degree at the University of Chicago. So it's been completed, but that said, we'll discuss a little bit about future directions of this work, and I'm also open to hearing your comments for future work on this. My slide seems to be stuck. There we go. So this research was a mini ethnography of the car rapide, which is a bus system operating in Dakar, Senegal. Dakar is the capital of Senegal, which is a country on the West African coast, and it's a city located on a peninsula. So geographically, it's very tight, it's very bound on all sides by water. The car rapide in the picture here is one of the most ubiquitous forms of transportation in Dakar, and it's as much a work of art as it is a form of public transportation. As you can see in the photo, it has these really colorful paintings all over the sides, and even inside there's some cultural artifacts, and basically this vehicle represents a lot of different elements of Senegalese culture and society. It's one of the most instantly recognizable symbols of Senegal today. And actually, if you ever have the chance to go to the Fields Museum in Chicago, they have a car rapide on display. So it's quite well known throughout the world because of its artistic exterior. Despite the car rapide being culturally significant, however, it's widely regarded as being extremely dangerous. Many of these vehicles have been in operation since the 1970s or 80s, and the mechanics have just been patching them up as they start to break down. So they're quite unsafe at times. And as a result of this, in the mid-2010s, the government of Senegal vowed to retire the car rapide from Dakar streets by 2018. This was just one goal in the Emergent Senegal Plan, which aims to transform Senegal into a middle-income country by 2035. So my research, which again I completed in 2018, sought to understand the car rapide both as a space of cultural production and participation, while also situating it within the larger political discourse that was happening around development and modernity. My slides just don't want to turn today. There we go. Okay. So the goals of my research were really twofold, and they asked the following questions. The first goal was to provide an ethnographic account of the soon-to-be retired car rapide. So I really wanted to understand the history of the car rapide in Dakar, and then I also wanted to understand how the car rapide actually works. It's an informal form of transportation, and so it doesn't work the way that quote-unquote normal buses do. Rather, it has its own unspoken rules of use. And so I wanted to catalog those unspoken rules. I wanted to understand how the routes and fare system worked. I also wanted to understand how it was a space for cultural participation and production. And I also wanted to understand how it compared to other forms of public transportation in the city that were operating at the same time in varying forms of formal and informal modes of transit. Secondly, I wanted to understand the larger political and developmental context of transportation in Dakar, as Senegal is currently undergoing this overall structural transformation of the economy. And so I asked questions like, how do middle-class Dakarois feel about the loss of a cultural icon in the name of modernity? How do they envision the future of public transportation in Dakar? And how might retiring the car rapide alleviate some of Dakar's transportation problems, namely really bad congestion on the streets? So I collected my qualitative data in December of 2017, and this really had three core tenets to it. The first was participant observation. I spent over 20 hours riding the car rapide and a few other bus systems in Dakar, just getting on at one end of the route, riding it to the end, and making the return trip. I also observed marked and unmarked bus stops just to see how frequently the buses were stopping and to observe the behavior of the people there. I kept analytical and reflective field notes in a journal, and I also bolstered these observations with 15 semi-structured interviews of 60 minutes in length. I interviewed 12 men and 3 women, and all of my respondents were middle or upper class Dakarois who had extensive experience riding the car rapide as their primary form of transportation. These interviews really served to add color and depth to the participant observations, and I also conducted interview-like conversations. These were really just 1 to 5 minute long conversations that I had with various people, mostly on the streets or in the car rapide itself, and I would ask them questions about how they feel about the car rapide more generally. So in terms of analysis, all of my interviews and field notes were transcribed and then imported into MAXQDA, and I used a grounded theory approach for my analysis. So if you're not super familiar with it, grounded theory seeks to find emergent themes in the data rather than imposing a predetermined theory or lens upon them. In doing part of my literature review, I found that a lot of the literature talking about transportation in Dakar, and especially talking about the car rapide, was really looking at it from a developmental and also infrastructural point of view. And I really wanted to get away from that. I didn't want to look at this as a transportation infrastructure project, but rather an ethnography, as I've said. So I conducted my coding in 3 cycles. The first was descriptive coding, where I identified the general topic of conversation. The second was initial coding, where I created lots and lots of tentative codes based on emergent themes in the data. And then I did a general cycle of just third cycle coding, where I went back and refined the codes from the previous 2 cycles, and I also created new codes as I saw fit. Throughout the process, I really relied on memos to not only catalog my analytical process, but also just to keep track of my working theories and ideas. Memos proved to be really valuable just as like notes to self, and at the end they actually formed a lot of the analysis sections of the final thesis. So as I mentioned, because I worked iteratively through grounded theory, my project was ultimately able to uncover themes that I might not have found if I had been working purely with that developmental framework in mind. So in my first cycle coding, I used highlighter pens for descriptive coding. Highlighter pens, I find, are typically used just to highlight important segments of text that the researcher finds, but I really like to use the highlighter pens for descriptive coding because I think in MAXQDA, color is such a powerful visual tool, and by using the highlighter pen strategically, you're able to really distill the topic of the conversation just at a glance. So what I did essentially was I assigned each type of bus its own color. So here in the screenshot, you can see that the Tata bus was pink, the car rapide was blue, and then the Demdik, which are more modern buses, sort of the type of bus that you would see in Chicago or any similar city, that one was green. And so I went through the interview and basically just assigned a color to the transcript based on the type of bus that the respondent was discussing. And it quickly became evident that you actually can't talk about the car rapide without referencing these other buses. So my respondents were constantly making comparisons between the car rapide and others, and this became evident because you can see it a little bit in this screenshot, but when the highlighter pens overlap, they create a new color. So here you can see that we were talking about the car rapide and the dem dic at the same time. Because of the colors as well, you can also quickly visualize shifts in the conversation. So I can see here just by looking at it that first we were talking about the Tata, then we were talking about the car rapide, and then we went back to the Tata before talking about the dem dic more in depth. So in the second cycle of coding, I created lots and lots of initial codes based on emerging themes in the data. And so when you do initial coding or generally any type of coding using grounded theory, a lot of the times what happens is you have a huge list of codes that are not super organized. And so the creative coding tool was really critical in this stage to not only organize my codes into a hierarchy, but also to just think through the relationships of my codes, and also to identify the various aspects of the car rapide that would eventually become the ethnographic portion of my thesis. So essentially what I did in the creative coding tool was I put in all of my tentative codes, and then using the dynamic workspace, I was able to group them together thematically. So it's a little bit small in the screenshot here, but essentially what I have in the middle is a master level code about the bus journey or experience. And then branching out, I have different elements of the bus. So I have problems and challenges with all of the challenges underneath as third or fourth level codes. Same with actors and other things like the bus action, such as how it would pull to the side to pick up passengers. Lastly, the code relations browser was really key to comparing and contrasting the car rapide to other forms of transit, and also to situating it within the larger political discourse. So because I had superimposed my initial codes over my descriptive codes, what ended up happening was I could use the code relations browser to visually view the frequency of overlap between those thematic codes and the descriptive codes. So here in the screenshot going across the top, I have the descriptive codes for each type of bus. So I have the dem dic, the car rapide, the Tata. And then going down the left-hand column are all of my thematic codes. So at each intersection, there's a little square icon, and the size of the square represents the frequency at which those two codes overlap. So just looking at this, I can tell right off the bat that safety was much more of an issue on the car rapide than it was on the dem dic. This also allowed me to view the frequency of overlap between the more thematic codes that I had, and in particular, while I was working on this research, one theme that kept coming up again and again was this concept of indiscipline. And so I coded for that, and I was able to see how indiscipline related to some of the other both abstract and more tangible codes that I had created. Of course, when you identify the frequency of overlap between codes, it tells you a little bit about, that there might be a relationship between those two themes. But at the end of the day, when you're doing qualitative work, I think it's really important to go back to the context in which that relationship occurs. And so to that end, the complex coding queries were really critical because it allowed me to not only say, okay, I know that there's a relationship between, for example, indiscipline and education, because my respondents are talking about those two themes at the same time, but I don't know necessarily how they're speaking of those two things at the same time. And so what the complex query, coding query allows you to do is it allows you to find the segments of text that have both of those codes assigned to them. So this was really critical in just, again, going back to the original context of things and actually viewing what my respondents were saying about those codes. So through this general analytical process, I was able to come to a few conclusions about the Carapid in Senegalese society. And these conclusions really go back to those two goals that I talked about in the very beginning. The first was, of course, I wanted to provide an ethnographic account of the Carapid and how it works, how people use it, everything about it. And so my thesis ultimately spoke to how the Carapid is an informal but complex form of transportation, and I cataloged all of the unspoken norms and rules of use. It also found that, as I suspected, the Carapid is a space for cultural production, and people from all walks of life were able to confer in the Carapid, and it was actually more than just a form of transportation, a space for conversation and for debate. But, as I mentioned at the very beginning as well, despite its cultural significance, the sheer lack of safety really negated any positive qualities about it, and my respondents were overwhelmingly in favor of getting rid of it. So that brings me to the larger political context. Really, when my respondents thought about the state retiring the Carapid, they really doubted the government's ability to deliver on that promise. And more than that, going back to that theme I found of indiscipline, my respondents were, interestingly, really arguing that even if the government delivered on its promise to modernize the buses, Dakar's problems would not be solved. They really argued that there's a plague of undisciplined behavior that is most emblematic on the Carapid, but that infects every aspect of Senegalese society. And so what they were really calling for at the end of the day was for some kinds of public education campaigns about public behavior and comportment. So ultimately, this research really engaged with a larger body of literature on race in colonial French Africa, of course, because indiscipline is a French colonial idea, and ambivalence in the post-colonial context. Lastly, to wrap up, this mini ethnography really taught me a few key things about MAXQDA. The first was that, as Johnny Saldana says in his coding manual book, initial coding might alert the researcher that more data are needed to support and build an emerging theory. And I really found that to be the case as I tried to explore this notion of indiscipline. My data really spoke to how indiscipline works on the Carapid, but it fell short of fully understanding it in the larger political context. So definitely more research is needed in that domain. But this was a one-year master's program, and so I couldn't go back. But, I think this leaves the door open for the future if I choose to get a PhD. Secondly, when I conducted this project, I was really new to MAXQDA, and this was really my first exploration of the software. Since then, I've used it a ton of times, and I've become quite good at it. But at the time, I wasn't aware of some shortcuts that I now am. The first being that, I talked about using the code relations browser and then following up with a complex coding query. But actually, I found now that the code relations browser will perform a complex code inquiry for you if you just click on the little squares, the square icons that are in the chart. But I think that just goes to show that MAXQDA is really a truly dynamic tool, and there's really no right or wrong way to leverage its tools. You saw how I used the highlighter code as descriptive coding, which I think is a quite unusual use for it. So there's just often multiple ways of achieving an action or a function, and MAXQDA is just so flexible to meet the needs and unique work style of the researcher. So that's it. I know this presentation was really rough to watch, and I just thank all of you for kind of hanging in there with the tech issues that I had here.